Well, happy Wednesday evening to everyone. This is where the radio fun begins. It begins because you get your beginner's ham radio license through the course by passing a 35-question multiple choice test. And so we go through a book chapter by chapter, emphasizing the test questions and answers that you might see, and we'll give you a little bit of ham radio lore and history and practical information along the way. I'm your instructor, Gary, ham radio call sign, Whiskey 4, Echo, Echo, Yankee. And just for the record, this is the book that we use. It's the American Radio Relay League's license manual for the technician, the 5th edition. There were earlier editions, but you want the 5th edition because that has the current questions and answers. All of the questions and answers are actually in the back of the book. And you can memorize the right answer. That's one way. But if you participate in a class, hopefully we give you a little bit more context and information so that you know not only what is the right answer, but why it's the right answer. That's our goal. That's what we're trying to do. So come on aboard. We've got a live stream on YouTube and a Zoom classroom. So let's go ahead and get started. Tonight we're going to be talking about Chapter 4, Propagation, Antennas, and Feed Lines. And these are all involved in getting our signal from where we are to where we want it to go. And folks who are not, into radio yet, beginners or just folks who are interested, sometimes will ask me, well, Gary, can I get a radio that I can hold in my hand and it says it's got a 20-mile range? Can I get one of those? Well, tonight we're going to talk about how radio waves propagate, how they get from point A to point B, and you'll learn some truths and when that radio could possibly go 20 miles and when it's likely not to. Then we'll also talk about some other aspects of the hobby with antennas, which is something that hams can build quite easily. And then also transmission lines and feed lines, which also goes into impedance matching, which is important to getting all of our power from our radio out into space. So let's go ahead and get started. There are 4 sections tonight. We'll go through 2 of them, take a 5-minute intermission, and then come on back and finish out the chapter. So propagation is section 4.1. Okay, here's our lowly ham. I kind of cut off the left side of the graphic there, but he's a ham who's walking with a handheld in his hand, and if you notice, he's about 6 feet tall. And if we took away all of the buildings and all of the trees and all of the vegetation, something that they call the bald earth, his radio would go 3.47 miles until it hits the curve of the earth and would be blocked because he's only 6 feet tall. So that magic radio that you hold in your hand that can go 20 miles directly, not likely in this case because that's when the radio waves are going to be blocked by the surface of the earth. Now, if you had 2 6-foot people, maybe you could go 6 miles or 7 miles before the problem would occur. But just keep that in mind. Radio waves, we talk about them, but they're electromagnetic waves, so this is kind of a definition. We talk about radio waves range, that's the distance over which it can travel, and that point that on the curvature of the Earth, that's the radio horizon. That's the distance over which 2 stations can communicate directly by a direct path. So our would-be ham here is, he's a 6-foot tall human. Well, there are obstructions, hills and buildings and things like that can get in the way of direct path or line of sight communications. And to overcome this, let me turn on my laser pointer over here. So that's what we're looking at here. Is we've got a tower with an antenna and it's trying to go over to this house, but it's being blocked by this hill. A taller tower, a taller structure transmitting from a higher point can overcome those obstructions and can make the signal get through by a direct wave or a direct path. That's why radio repeater systems, which are used to receive radio signals and then rebroadcast them on another frequency, are usually located on mountaintops or on very tall broadcast towers or tall buildings, because you want this height advantage. And when you're calculating the radio horizon from where you are, you need to know that radio waves go slightly farther than light. So here we have the example with the blue line. Here's the transmitter. This is light. And so at this point in time, light continues to go on out into space, whereas radio signals are actually, to some extent, following the curvature of the Earth. So they go slightly farther than a light wave would go through a process of refraction. Another way that you can make radio waves do funny things, go around corners, is something called knife edge diffraction. This is where you have in the path something with a sharp point, like maybe the edge of a building, and if you can direct your radio signal toward that sharp point, it's likely that the radio wave will refract around that and go around corners, so to speak. This happens with VHF and above, and radio signals can go around barriers. We're jumping over a lot of topics here. This isn't an electronics class. This is an amateur radio licensing class. So I've had some people tell me that there's a lot of stuff in this chapter. Unfortunately, that's the nature of the beast. But keep going. You'll absorb it. It'll come in. So another thing that we want to be aware of with radio signals, especially the direct path type signals like VHF and UHF, is something called multipath. So here we have our tower and our transmitter, and it's transmitting to a radio over here. So here is the direct path, and so it's coming to the radio, but there's some attenuation being provided by vegetation here, so the signal on the direct path is somewhat less than it would be otherwise. Also, then we have knife edge diffraction going on with these tall buildings. So the signal's coming here, being diffracted back around and coming back into the radio. Another is we've got these buildings over here. The signal's coming in and it's being reflected or bounced off the buildings because of the structure of the buildings maybe promotes this. Maybe they're all metal. And so in this case, the radio is not going to just receive one signal on the direct path. Rather, it's going to receive all three of those signals. And how they add and subtract can enhance reception, or can actually make signals kind of go away. We'll talk more about that in a special case. But we can use the diffraction, as I mentioned before, the knife edge diffraction, or we can use reflection to our advantage. So come back to me for a second, Bruce, if you would. I used to live over in Greenville County in South Carolina, the upstate of South Carolina. And the neighborhood that I was in was on the west side of Paris Mountain. I guess it'd be the west side, yeah. And I wanted to receive the television signal, a VHF television signal from Channel 7 in Spartanburg, WSPA. But unfortunately, they were on the east side of Paris Mountain, and so their signal would not penetrate to our neighborhood. I had a big TV antenna up on the roof, but still, so come back to the slide. What I did was I used one of these techniques. So here's my old house here. Here's Paris Mountain. Here's Channel 7's transmitter, and they're transmitting, and oh, it's not bouncing off of Paris Mountain, not getting to me. What I was able to do was take my antenna and point it toward downtown Greenville, South Carolina, where, okay, there's not skyscrapers, but there are tall buildings down there. And I was able to receive a reflection off of the buildings in downtown Greenville and found a path that allowed me to receive Channel 7, a VHF radio signal. So you can use these, and sometimes you have to use them if the direct path is being blocked. Maybe you can find an alternate way to get a signal through. Sometimes this requires a directional antenna system to help you out in that regard. All right, I mentioned that we had multipath and we had signals coming in from various directions. How many of you have been in your car, you're listening to FM radio because the music fidelity is great, and the light just turned red, so you're coming up to the light and you're slowing down, and you stop the car, and your favorite song is just coming on the radio, and as you get up to and you stop, all of a sudden the signal from the station goes away. What? But then if you creep the car up just maybe another foot and a half, all of a sudden the signal comes back. Why is that? Multipath. You've positioned the car, the antenna for the radio in the car, at a certain point where multiple signals were coming in, maybe from the direct path, from reflections, from diffraction, and they're adding together, and at that one point they canceled out completely and the signal went away. But if you move just slightly, all of a sudden the equation changes. So that's multipath. And multipath affects direct path from VHF and UHF, but it also affects ionospheric propagation. We'll talk more about that. Ionospheric propagation is more for the short waves or the high frequency bands. And there it causes fading. You might think of old movies from the era of the 1940s, and people are hunched around their radios, and you hear the shortwave radio broadcasts, and the signal comes up, and then it comes down in level, and it comes up. That's fading. That's multipath caused by ionospheric propagation conditions. When you're at home, kind of like with your car that I was mentioning that you could get in a certain spot and have a problem, you'll find at home when you're trying to get into a local radio repeater, there will be one spot, a sweet spot in your house where you can hear the radio repeater very well and the radio repeater can hear you. That's called your X. And you'll know it. It's in the living room over there by the window. That's the best place with my little HT for me to get into the local repeater. And you'll find that if you're talking to somebody and you have to move around, you may actually hear them say, "Hey, go back, you're off your X." What they're talking about is the fact that multipath is occurring, and it affects both received signals and transmitted signals as well. So just an oddity with amateur radio, that you'll find that there is going to be one spot in your house that's going to probably work better than any of the others. Now, we're talking about here analog FM signals on VHF, but it also impacts digital voice signals or digital data signals. And so if you have digital data that you're transmitting, here's a packet radio station, then what happens is that interference or garbling of the data will occur, and that means that the data's error rate goes up because of multipath interference. And the way to alleviate that is to change the antenna location to a point where signals are solid and stable, and the error rate for the data will go down. Now, I've been talking about VHF and UHF because, remember, as a technician licensee, the beginning license in the United States, you have full privileges on the VHF and UHF radio frequencies. So you can operate there without restrictions. And VHF and UHF signals are interesting because, well, foliage. Why is the range greater in the winter than it is in the summer? Well, it can be because of absorption by the leaves on trees and vegetation. Whereas in the winter, when the leaves have fallen to the ground, you have a clearer path. So just keep that in mind. At some point in time, you may decide you want to put a radio in your car. Come back to me for a second, Bruce. So if you've got a mobile radio in your car, you can drive along. It's interesting that amateur radio operators, it's a safety issue. You want to make sure that you can operate your car and the radio safely. And that's why there are prohibitions on using cell phones in cars. Here in South Carolina, there is a legal, what do I want to say, privilege that amateur radio operators have, that it is legal to operate amateur radio equipment while mobile here in South Carolina. Now you have to check on your locale to see if it is, but generally it is because of the public safety and public support that amateur radio operators give during disasters and things like that. So if you're in your car with a portable or a mobile VHF UHF radio, you've got an antenna, a mag mount antenna maybe on top of the car, and you're driving along, and you may hear somebody coming back to you and saying, hey, your signal was picket fencing. Picket fencing? What does that mean? It's another part of the reflection problem that we were talking about. As you go by buildings that are regular in a neighborhood or something like that, your signal, as you transmit it, can go up in signal strength, then down in signal strength, up in signal strength, down in signal strength, up, down, kind of like a picket fence is there, not there, there, not there. It happens both for transmission and for reception. That's picket fencing with your signal level fluctuating up and down as the vehicle moves along. And you'll hear it if you're listening on a local repeater. Sometimes you'll hear this, and somebody may comment on it. I mentioned, you'll have a nice spot in your house, your X, where you can get the best reception and transmission. This also goes back to then building penetration. How is your house or building constructed? And if it has windows, generally UHF will work inside the building better than VHF. Why? Well, because VHF wavelengths are longer, if I can get centered up on the camera here, than UHF wavelength. And so the radio wave can actually penetrate or go through openings like a window more easily than the wider wavelength radio signals. So generally, UHF has better penetration than VHF into buildings. All right, sit back. It's now story time. So I've had a long and varied career. I'm very, blessed in that. And so one of the jobs I used to have a long time ago was I worked as a broadcast engineer for a public broadcasting TV station up in Michigan. And PBS, this was back in the early 1980s, PBS was very forward-thinking. All of the television networks, NBC, CBS, ABC, had their signals being distributed from master control in New York City out to the stations via microwave relays. Maybe commercial microwave provided by the telephone company or private microwave links that the stations would install. And so these microwave hops would carry the video signal across the country. But that's expensive. And so PBS said, okay, this is going to be expensive too, but satellites are now available. What if we rented time on a C-band or 3 to 4 gigahertz satellite transponder space up there, and we could put our signals up from our master control up to the satellite and down from the satellite to all of our affiliates across the country. And the satellite antennas that were used were large dishes, about 6 meters at least in diameter. And it was a major investment for an affiliate and for the national organization, but it was a really great system in that it provided, instead of just one program channel, it provided 4. And provided also intercommunications to alert affiliates about issues or things that were happening. It had a kind of a texting service built into it. Really, forward thinking. So that was PBS. And then I moved from PBS to the local NBC affiliate and in Saginaw, Michigan, as a broadcast engineer. And NBC had seen what PBS had done and said, okay, we want in on that because it is, over time, a really big cost savings. So we want to get into that as well. So the NBC station and the network, they said, okay, we're going to go up on satellite, but we're going to go up C-band, the 3 to 4 gigahertz that I talked about, with the big antennas, the 6-meter diameter antennas. No, that's too much. We're going to go on satellites that are on the KU band, between 11 and 14 gigahertz. Shorter wavelengths, higher in frequency. And so this is what the antennas look like on the roof of the NBC station, WNEM-TV, it was NBC then, in Saginaw, Michigan. And so it worked great, except, and if you have Dish Network or DirecTV, they're also on KU band, where the wavelength is very small. 1 to 2 centimeters, and the problem comes in is when it rains. When it rains at the affiliate location in Michigan, the signal goes away because rain is close enough to the wavelength that it starts absorbing signal. And by the time the rain is coming down and the signal comes down from the satellite, it's all absorbed by the rain, and we would have outages. The PBS system on 3 gigahertz never had any problems because the wavelength was bigger. But NBC, we had problems. And it was double ironic because it was not only raining at the affiliate that would cause the problem, in Michigan, for example, rain at the uplink in New Jersey or wherever it was, that would wipe out the entire network. So they had to work through that. They had to work through how that was corrected. I don't know what they're using now, but that was always a problem. So just remember, and it affects DirecTV and Dish Network as well. So that's the reason, rain fade. So there is a test question. What are the effects of fog and light rain on the 6 and 10 meter bands? All right, let's put this in context. We were talking about NBC, the KU band, where we were talking about gigahertz frequencies, 10 to 14 gigahertz, really small wavelengths. The wavelength of 6 meters or 10 meters is huge in comparison. And so the effects of fog and light rain on the 6 and 10 meter signals, none. The wavelengths are just too large to be impacted by absorption by water molecules. So there is such a thing as rain fade before the ham bands, 6 meters and 10 meters, no impact. Anybody done a long distance car trip recently? The medium wave band at night is magical still. You can dial in stations that are coming from hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. Coming from Michigan as I did, sometimes I'll listen to WJR on 760 because they have a big 50,000 watt transmitter, and it'll get down here to South Carolina at night, no problem whatsoever. So that's kind of fun. Well, during the day, it goes away. Why is that? Well, that has to do with ground wave and skywave propagation. So during the day, the primary mode of propagation from an AM radio tower, here's our AM radio tower, is going to be along the ground, along the curvature of the Earth. Oh, we got a ship here, but okay, that's the illustration. Ground wave goes along the ground, and the skywave signal, there is a skywave signal that's emitted from the transmitter, but during the day, because of ionization of the atmosphere, it gets absorbed up here and never comes back down. Ground wave, though, follows the curvature of the Earth, so you can go probably about 70 miles out from an AM radio tower using vertical antennas. That's ground wave propagation. Hams can use that as well on 160 and even 80 meters. Ground wave propagation is a reliable mode during the day. And the radio wave actually kind of tilts as it's going around. So that's ground wave. But at night, well, the layers of the atmosphere, let's first talk about that. What we're interested in is the ionosphere, which is the outer layer of the Earth's atmosphere. And then, of course, we've got the stratosphere there in the middle, the troposphere down to Earth. So these are not all in scale here, but the ionosphere is the outmost layer of the Earth's atmosphere. And there are 4 distinct layers. There's the D layer, the E layer, and the F1 and F2 layers. And so during the day, because of the ionization of the sun, on the frequencies that medium wave uses, about 1 megahertz, signals coming from an antenna go up to the ionosphere, but they're absorbed. They're absorbed in the D layer. I call it the dead layer, because the D layer is created by ionization from the sun. Well, at night, the sun is on the opposite side of the Earth, so then we have, the moon is out here to indicate that. The D and E layers largely go away. Still a remnant of the E layer, but D layer is gone. So then signals can come from the transmitter up to the ionosphere and be refracted back down to Earth hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. So that's why you can receive distant medium wave stations on your car radio when you're driving across country at night. And so you can listen to WABC New York, for example, wherever you are, because of this effect, the skywave, which is propagated at night for medium wave. Now, we as hams use the ionosphere and use propagation through it all the time. We use the impact, the day-night differences that we talked about here on some of the bands. But during the day, the F1 and F2 layers are created, and some of our frequency bands, especially 10 meters, for example, when F1 and F2 layers are strong, they provide great refraction capabilities for 10 meters. So we'll see some of that here coming up here in a second. The E layer, this layer right here, is also good for VHF and UHF. They don't really know why this happens, but there are gaseous clouds that will form in the E layer. And these will provide intermittent communications, maybe no more than about a half an hour, where you can transmit up and have signals refracted back down. I've had VHF 6-meter single sideband contact from South Carolina to California, based on E layer, sporadic E layer propagation. So I say that hams, come back to me just for a second, Bruce. Hams are opportunists. Folks in the telecommunications industry, they want reliable communications all the time. We as hams, however, will take what we can get. And if there's an opportunity for good propagation because of the ionosphere, we'll take it. So that's why we monitor propagation conditions, and I'll give you some resources here in a second, to find out when propagation conditions might be good and what frequency bands. Something we need to know about, though, also is that, and this changes from day to day and hour to hour, what is the critical frequency? There is a critical frequency that above that frequency, if we send a signal up to the ionosphere, it won't be refracted back down to Earth. Rather, it goes off into space. So here it's marked as 100 megahertz. Whereas a 20 megahertz signal comes back down to Earth, or a 5 megahertz signal will also be refracted back down to Earth. So in this case, anything above 100 megahertz or thereabouts is above the critical frequency, and it's going to go up into outer space. Now, sometimes that's a good thing. NASA wants reliable communications to the International Space Station, and of course to any manned space flights that might occur. Remember the lunar missions and whatnot. All of those communications were on UHF radio. Some VHF, but mostly UHF radio, because those signals would penetrate the ionosphere and go out into space, which is where they wanted them to go. So that's the reason that they didn't use HF, high frequencies, for space missions, because they'd be refracted back down and the signal wouldn't go where they wanted it. So the critical frequency, just know about that. And it will vary from day to day and from hour to hour. The ionosphere, though, is magic, and it will allow hams with very small transmitters, 100-watt transmitters, to be able to talk thousands of miles away. And right now, where we are, the ionosphere is in great shape. And it's largely due to something that you wouldn't even think about. It's due to the sun and sunspots. Sunspots are exactly what you think they are. They're little spots that you can see if you have the right filters on the sun. And sunspot numbers go up and down in a regular 11-year cycle. And we are right now at the peak. This only goes out to, well, we were about right here. This is going up to 2031. This is where we are. And over the next 5 years, it's going to go back down to a minimum and then back up to another maximum another 5, 6 years later. So sunspots allow long-distance radio propagation on the higher frequency bands, 21 megahertz, 28 megahertz, the 6-meter band, 50 megahertz. So sunspots are good for these bands. Sunspots and daylight. That's the best thing. So you're going to get long distance propagation on the 10-meter band, for example, at noon when there are lots of sunspots. So keep that in mind. And again, we're opportunists. If that's where the action is going to be, that's where we want to be as well. And it's true, right now, with very low power radios, like this little 10-meter handy-talkie, you can actually now, with 5 watts, talk thousands of miles away when the 10-meter band is open because of the sunspots and the ionization that goes on.
Right.
You had a question?
I do, yeah. So you're saying then that sometimes, like in the daytime, high frequency, you know, the 6 to 10, but then at night, I would think then that same band would use the ionosphere to refract back to Earth in a form of hopping. So you're
for those frequency bands, yeah, for those bands, 10 meters, for example, is a daytime band. At night, it gets pretty quiet. Now, there are exceptions to the rule, but it would be unique to have good long-distance propagation on 10 meters at night. But during the day, it's very common. Because the F1 layer and the F2 layers are very well formed during the daytime, where they're not very well formed at night.
Oh, okay. All right.
It's a matter of degrees.
Yeah.
So this is what we're talking about here is ionospheric propagation, but there are other modes of propagation as well. And as you might remember, I used to work for the Voice of America, and VOA had a site in the Philippines. They actually had 3 sites. They had a transmitter site in Tanang, a transmitter site at Poro Point, and a receiver site in Baguio, which is the summer capital in the Philippines. And to transmit signals being received at the receiver site down to the transmitter sites, this was before reliable satellite communication or others. They used something called tropospheric communication. Which was on VHF and UHF frequencies. It used, these look like satellite antennas, but they're not. They're actually pointed toward the horizon. And so they would get reliable communications about 300 miles. Well, in this case it was 50 kilometers, but you can get up to 300 miles from Baguio to Poro Point, for example, sending the VOA radio programs from the receiver site to the transmitter site. So this is known as tropospheric communications. Think of tropical. Think of thermal layers. that actually will carry the signal out as far as 300 miles. It's a way that hams can get their signals out farther as well. And you will hear this usually in the spring and in the fall. Sometimes radio repeaters will start receiving signals from hundreds, if not thousands of miles away, because that's typically when thermal inversions occur. Normally, the Earth is warm, and warm air comes up from Earth, and it gets colder as it goes up in the air. But sometimes you can have an inversion where you've got cold air coming back down, a layer of warm air in the middle, cold air above, and if you can get a radio frequency signal into this warm air layer, it can actually go hundreds of miles. So here in the upstate of South Carolina on our Caesar's Head repeater, sometimes we will hear signals coming in from New Jersey in the spring and in the fall due to this thermal inversion, which is a kind of tropospheric ducting that is transmitting signals. Another way that signals can be received, normally if you have a transmitter and it's going up to the ionosphere and then back down to a station thousands of miles away, well, stations here in the middle wouldn't receive any signals normally. This is what they call the skip zone. And so the signals would actually skip right over them, except that the ionosphere is not smooth. It's rough. It is not a single density. And because of that, you will get some reflection of energy coming back from the ionosphere back to this area, and it's called backscatter. So that's backscatter propagation on the high frequency bands using ionospheric propagation. A lot of stuff. But remember, that's what this section is all about, is propagation. Another way that hams have used things to their advantage are meteors. There are regular meteor showers that come down to Earth, and the 6-meter band has a wavelength that tends to match the nominal size of meteor trails. And because of that, you can actually send 6-meter or 50 megahertz signals from directional antennas up to meteor swarms, and it can be received hundreds if not thousands of miles away from being reflected off of meteors. I have not done that, but it is done regularly by amateur radio operators. Now, one thing that I did get the chance to do about a year ago was make my first contact using Aurora. So the Aurora Borealis in the northern hemisphere, or the Aurora Australis in the southern hemisphere, that's caused when there's a solar particle eruption on the sun that distorts the Earth's magnetic fields, and it causes the very pretty lights and whatnot that you see in the northern hemisphere to the north. And in fact, we've seen the aurora down in South Carolina even this past year because of very strong auroras. Well, hams figured out that they could bounce signals, usually on 6 meters, to the aurora and have a signal return. So let me turn here in Zoom original sound on, so that it's not distorted by anything. Okay, and I want to play you a little segment of some auroral single sideband communications. Don't be freaked out. It sounds distorted. This is a Canadian ham and recordings that he made and put up on YouTube. Oh, I got to turn off my laser pointer, or I can't start it. All right, let's try this.
5 and 8 Aurora, 5 and 8 Aurora, Fox November 3-2. Call is Kilo Charlie 2, Whiskey Lima Radio, over.
Yeah, QSL, nice to see you again, and beautiful signal on the Aurora, 5 and 9 Aurora here, 59 Aurora, Fox Norway 2-5, over.
QSL, Kevin, you're also 5973, thank you.
73 and good luck. Victor Echo 3 Echo November. I'm going to QSY up 5.
So now he's tuning his radio up to a different frequency. distorted the signal sounds?
Okay, QRZ, Victor Echo 3, Echo November, Victor Echo 3, Echo November, QRZ.
Alpha Alpha 1 Tango Tango.
Alpha Alpha 1 Tango Tango, nice to see you, nice signal. 5 and 7, 57 Aurora, Fox Norway 25, Fox November 25, over.
Yes, Alpha, copy 5-8 Aurora. A2 Foxtrot, November 33, FM 33, over.
QSL, thanks for Fox November 33 and enjoy the opening. We're a lot of strong signals out there. Alpha Alpha 1 Tango Tango, Victor Echo 3, Echo November 73.
So that's an auroral communication, and it happens on 6 meters. You point your antenna north, and you start listening for signals. And I made my first contact using the Aurora to another station in Ohio. It wasn't direct path. It was going up to the North Pole and then coming back down. Sounded exactly like you heard there, very distorted. That was interesting. All right. Let's move on here. Whoops. There we go. We talked about sporadic E layer propagation earlier with the clouds, and remember I said I had one of those propagation conditions go from South Carolina to California, so 10 meters, 6 meters, and 2 meters are the bands that are likely to have sporadic E propagation. Oh, by the way, remember if you forgot, anything that's in blue text is likely going to be something that is going to be on the test for you to be concerned about. All right. We talked about the critical frequency. Remember that was anything above that critical frequency was likely to go out into space. So there are also frequencies known as the LUF and the MUF, okay? Lowest usable frequency and maximum usable frequencies. And these change, these are calculated from point A to point B. So from South Carolina to London, for example. What would be the lowest usable frequency that I could use to try to make propagation, and what's the maximum usable frequency? And it can vary by the time of day, and generally you want to be just below the maximum usable frequency in order to get your signal out with the strongest signal. Note that higher ham bands tend to work better during the day because they need sunspots. The lower ham bands, lower in frequency, have a chance at long distance transmission at night and are independent of sunspot numbers. They'll work well even during the low sunspot times. A special case of propagation is the in-between time between light and dark, sunrise and sunset. When there's a transition between light and darkness, there is, let me turn my laser pointer back on again. There is this band. Now this is on a Mercator projection, so it's a flat map, but there's a band between the light and dark regions. This is known as the gray line, and it has special radio propagation characteristics. So if we happen to be, for example, out in California right now, this might be a good time to make a contact using gray line into Eastern Europe, for example. And this, as the sun moves and processes, it is going to change where the gray line is located. So this window of opportunity for gray line propagation is only good for about maybe half an hour maximum. So Gary, how can I know where I'm going to transmit, where I'm going to listen? What's the thing? Well, your tax dollars at work. Remember I said I worked for the Voice of America, and it was VOA's job to get U.S. government radio programs in over 50 languages from a transmitter site into a target location and to do it effectively. And so over the years, VOA developed propagation software that would analyze current ionospheric conditions, sunspots, etc., and tell programmers and engineers what the best frequency and what the best transmitter angles. It was called VOA CAP. coverage area prediction software, and it's available for free online at this URL. And so you can put in information about your station and the desired location that you might like to work, let's say London, and it'll tell you on this rosette here what the best time, this is a clock, so what the best time and what the best frequency to use in order to make that happen. This is one of the propagation prediction tools that's available to you, and you paid for it as a U.S. taxpayer, so you should be able to take advantage of it. There are other websites that indicate about space weather and space weather conditions. Remember, I talked about sunspot numbers. That has an impact. Coronal mass ejections, those are bad. We don't want those. Solar flares, those are bad. They'll probably negatively impact radio propagation. So there are various websites here where you can find out more information about what's going on. And if you'd like a weather forecast, did you know we have our own weather woman? Space weather woman. Dr. Tamitha Skov has her own YouTube channel and her own website, spaceweatherwoman.com. She's a ham. She became a ham. And you will actually see her at some of the national conventions. Sometimes she'll attend, and does a great weather forecast for the sun. And she always includes a section for amateur radio operators, how things are going to, look as far as our propagation conditions. All right, that was section 4.1 on propagation. Let's see what we can remember. So go ahead, the 3-second rule, give 3 seconds, and then you can unmute and tell me what you think the answer might be. So why do VHF signal strengths sometimes vary greatly when the antenna is moved only a few feet? Charlie, yes, multipath propagation cancels or reinforces signals. And what is the effect of vegetation on UHF and microwave signals?
Bravo.
Yeah, everybody see that? Bravo says absorption. Yes, the leaves on the trees will absorb the signal. And what is the meaning of the term picket fencing?
Bravo.
You're getting good. Bravo it is. Okay, give somebody else a chance to answer. Rapid flutter on mobile signals due to multipath propagation. All right, what weather condition might decrease range at microwave frequencies? Think NBC. What did you say, Charlie?
Charlie, yeah.
Yeah, Charlie, precipitation, absolutely. At the microwave frequencies, the 10 gigahertz and up, yep. All right, so what is a likely cause of irregular fading of signals propagated by the ionosphere?
Is it delta?
It is delta. It's multipath. It's the random combining of signals arriving via different paths. So the signal strength will come up and come down. We have a Q code for that, QSB. Your signal is fading. So what effect does multipath propagation have on data transmissions?
E is in delta.
Yes, delta. Phonetics are always good, especially on Zoom because it kind of chops a little bit. So yeah, error rates are likely to increase. So which region of the atmosphere can refract or bend HF and VHF radio waves?
C is in Charlie.
That's the ionosphere. All right, give somebody else a turn now. So what is the effect of fog and rain on signals in the 10 meter and 6 meter bands?
B.
B is correct. There is little effect because their wavelengths are much larger than rain droplets. So why are simplex UHF signals rarely heard beyond their radio horizon?
C, Charlie.
See, Charlie is correct because UHF signals go right out into space. They're not usually propagated by the ionosphere back down to Earth. And what is a characteristic of HF communications compared with communications on VHF and higher frequencies?
C.
That's correct. Long-distance ionospheric propagation is far more common on high-frequency bands. VHF and UHF is mostly line of sight, with some special cases of the sporadic E and things like that. But on HF, on the shortwave, you can go long-distance all the time. So what is a characteristic of VHF signals received via auroral backscatter? You heard it.
Bravo.
Yeah, they're distorted, and the signal strength will vary considerably. Sounds kind of like Darth Vader. So which of the following types of propagation is most commonly associated with occasional strong signals on the 10, 6, and 2 meter bands from beyond the radio horizon?
B, Bravo.
B, Bravo, sporadic E, those gaseous clouds that form in the E layer. And which of the following effects may allow radio signals to travel beyond obstructions between the transmitting and receiving stations?
Alpha, knife edge diffraction.
That is correct. You can use knife edge diffraction to go around buildings. It's a superpower. So what type of propagation is responsible for allowing over-the-horizon VHF and UHF communications to ranges of approximately 300 miles on a regular basis?
Alpha.
It's what VOA did in the Philippines. It's tropospheric ducting. And what band is best suited for communicating via meteor scatter?
Bravo.
Yep, 6 meters because the wavelength kind of matches the meteor tail's lengths. So what causes tropospheric ducting? Tropo?
Inversions D.
Tropo, think tropical, think thermal, yeah, temperature inversions in the atmosphere. And what is generally the best time for long distance 10 meter band propagation via the F region?
A is an alpha.
From dawn to shortly after sunset. So during the day, that's what they're saying there, during periods of high sunspot activity like we have right now. Yes, that's it. So which of the following bands may provide long-distance communications via the ionosphere's F region during the peak of the sunspot cycle?
A.
Yes, 6 and 10 meters, especially 10 meters. So why is the radio horizon for VHF and UHF signals more distant than the visual horizon?
Refraction.
Yeah, so which one is that?
C, Charlie.
Yes, the atmosphere refracts radio waves slightly. Great job. All right, so that's section 4.1. Let's go on to 4.2, antenna and radio wave basics. So come back to me for just a second there, Bruce. So I always do this. The most basic kind of antenna that we have in ham radio is called the dipole antenna, and I always stick my arms out like this because you feed a dipole antenna at the center and it goes out horizontally. Well, let's look at a pictorial. This is what it looks like. Here's our antenna, a dipole antenna, 2 poles. It's being fed by feed line coming from your transmitter. There's an insulator in the middle that keeps the 2 sides separated, and one side of the coax cable goes to one side of the antenna, and the other side of the coax cable goes to the other side of the antenna. And each of these links is important. It's a quarter of a wavelength of the frequency that you're designing the antenna for. So it's a quarter of a wavelength in this direction, and it's a quarter of a wavelength in this direction. So a quarter and a quarter makes a half. So this is what we call a half-wave dipole antenna. It is the most basic antenna, and it's used everywhere for all sorts of communications. Even for the big directional antennas, the driven element of the antenna is likely a half-wave dipole of some type. And this antenna will radiate an electromagnetic wave. And that electromagnetic wave that it radiates has two components. It has an electric field and a magnetic field. And the electric fields and magnetic fields are at 90 degrees with each other. And if we kind of put this in motion, so here we have electric field, which is the blue in vertical right now, you see the E there, and the magnetic field, which is horizontal there, the red, and the two of them working together will propagate a radio signal, a radio wave signal, away from the antenna. Now, we're not going to go into the complexities of how this is done. Just know that there are these two things. And that's why it's called an electromagnetic wave. Electric field, magnetic field. Electromagnetic wave comes off of an antenna. And we say that an antenna has polarization. It corresponds to the electric field. So if the electric field is vertical, as it is in this case, then we say that the antenna is vertically polarized. And it also generally corresponds to the antenna's physical orientation. So you see it's up and down. So this is, again, a vertically polarized antenna. Over on the left here, we have a horizontal electric field, and the antenna is horizontal to the Earth. So this is a horizontally polarized antenna, whereas we have here a vertically polarized antenna. In amateur radio, we use both. And in fact, if you've been in a parking lot at a ham radio club meeting, you've probably seen cars looking something like this. What do you think? Are these antennas horizontally polarized, or are they vertically polarized?
They're vertically polarized?
Yeah, they're up and down, so that's vertical polarization. It corresponds to the electric field and also the physical orientation of the antenna. So my bonus question is, if you know, we had a lot of these mobile signals on VHF with strong signals and whatnot, and we want to listen for the very weak signals, what could we do to kind of avoid all of this mess? And that would be to use horizontal antennas. There is isolation between vertical antennas and horizontal antennas. And so weak signal VHF and UHF work is all done with horizontal polarized antennas. So that's, you see here, it's horizontal to the Earth. Here's maybe the driven element, which is probably a half-wave dipole. And then we have reflector and director elements on this antenna. We'll talk more about this. But this beam antenna or directional antenna is using horizontal polarization. One of the reasons is to avoid interference from those vertical antennas. And this is doesn't have to be in ham radio. The commercial world, European satellites for years and years and years used horizontal and vertical orientations of antennas in their low noise block converters so that they could get extra channels on the satellites that were orbiting overhead to carry the TV programs that are so commonly distributed in Europe. So they had both an H probe, horizontal, and a V probe, vertical, and these were quarter wavelength long antennas in the low noise block converter. And H and V, they had between 20 and 30 dB of isolation between the two, which is typical. And so that's a way that people can use polarization to get a greater channel capacity. Now, On high frequencies, or the shortwave bands between 3 megahertz and 30 megahertz, remember we use the ionosphere for long distance communications. We have our transmitter and we transmit up to the ionosphere, and the signal is refracted back down to a receiver. So the question comes in, well, you know, I've seen both vertical antennas and horizontal antennas being used on HF. Is there a problem with that? No, because of the ionosphere. When the signal goes up here, it may go up as a horizontally polarized signal, but the ionosphere will tumble the signal, kind of make it both horizontal and vertical. We call it an elliptical pattern. And so either a vertical antenna or horizontal antenna here will work equally as well. So both H and V polarized antennas will work well on the shortwave or high frequency bands, 3 to 30 megahertz. So we've been talking about antennas. Come back to me for just a second, Bruce. So how are we going to compare antennas, or you know, what's the theory behind it? Engineers decided to start at the very basics, and they say, okay, what if we had an antenna that was infinitely small, like the size of a point, and it would radiate out in all directions in a sphere equally well. And so that was a design concept or a theoretical concept, and it's called an isotropic antenna or an isotropic radiator. And this isotropic radiator antenna is with the point source there and radiating equally well in all directions. Now, we can't build those because we can't build something that is minute, ultra minute, and goes because of reflections and refractions and things like that. But this is a concept that they can then compare other antennas to what this theoretically would do to what antennas are actually doing. So you will see gain comparisons, for example, made against an isotropic radiator, which is, you need to know, it's a theoretical concept. And when they talk about antenna gain, they're talking about shifting the pattern of the antenna by squishing the signal in certain directions, so it goes further in one direction and not as well in another. So by design, an antenna's pattern can be squished to provide more signal in certain directions. And the most common antenna that does this is a beam antenna. It's an antenna with gain, and this is a Yagi antenna. We'll talk more about that in a second. Here's our half-wave antenna, the dipole, the driven element here, and we've got a reflector behind it, and then we have multiple directors going out. And the concept was developed by the Japanese, Mr. Yagi and Mr. Uda. So really the antenna should be called the Yagi Uda, except Uda worked for Mr. Yagi. So Mr. Yagi got all the credit. But if you want to hear the full story, you can go to the URL here. And Mr. Uda probably did more of the testing and the work behind it. But we still call it to this day a Yagi antenna. So a 6-meter Yagi antenna has a half wavelength driven element at the center. And it has, at a certain distance, something that is slightly longer, about 5% longer. This is the reflector. It reflects the radio wave that is coming from the driven element and goes back in this direction. And this director is about 5% shorter than the driven element, and this further enhances the signal in this direction. So this antenna has gain in one direction. We'll show you some patterns here coming up. So 6 meters, 50 megahertz, that's pretty easy to build, but you can also build them for the high frequency bands as well. And they've been some monsters that people have built. There have even been 160 meter Yagi antennas built. They didn't last very long because it's a monster construction, and weather and wind and everything took the toll. But here's a very common high gain TH3, for example, used on the 20 meter bands and up. So when they're making that comparison between an antenna, a gain antenna, and an isotropic, they express the gain not in factors of ×2 or ×4, but they use something called the decibel. And 1 decibel, excuse me, 1 dB is about a 20% increase. 3 dB is a 2 times increase. 6 dB is a 4 times increase. And 10 dB is a 10 times increase. So, and there's a formula, 10 log to the base 10 of the power 1 versus power 2. You don't need to do that. You don't need to know that. But there is a logarithmic relationship. Why do we use dBs? Because it works in engineering. You can compare very strong signals and very weak signals without having to do a lot of decimal points off to the left or to the right. So dBs are actually handy in engineering notation. When you get your transceiver or receiver, it'll have an S meter on it. The S meter is calibrated in S units. Here's S3, S5, S7, S9. And then after S9, it goes plus 10 dB, plus I think 30 dB, plus 60 dB. Each S unit variation from 5 to 6, for example, it's standardized at 6 dB, or 4 times to go from 5 to 6, for example. So you'd actually have to have a 4 times power gain at the transmitter to go from one to the other. I'm going to send you in the handouts a short story on decibels that hopefully will help clarify things. But what they're doing here is they're using decibels to compare the gain of an antenna versus that isotropic radiator. And even a vertical antenna, which is an omnidirectional antenna, is going to have some gain over that isotropic. Reason being is because, for example, a vertical antenna doesn't radiate up. It has very poor radiation above itself, but it has an omnidirectional pattern around the vertical antenna. So this is actually going to have gain in the horizontal plane over an isotropic antenna. You can actually see that indicated over here. So this is a vertical antenna, a vertical polarization, whereas our Yagi antenna is going to look something like this. So this is the direction where the signal is going to be the strongest, up to 12 dB over an isotropic. It's going to have some signal in the back, but much reduced. So this is called the front to back ratio. And it's going to have some nulls in here where there's barely any signal being sent out, and there's going to have some lobes, some side lobes as well. This is what it looks like for a directional beam antenna with a main lobe, some side lobes, some nulls, and the front to back ratio, the ratio of the gain in the forward direction to the gain in the reverse direction. So I got started teaching technician ham radio classes to a group of preppers here in the upstate of South Carolina, and this was a big thing for preppers. They wanted to know about NVIS antennas, near vertical incident skywave. What? What's a NVIS antenna? Well, a NVIS antenna is our friend the dipole antenna that is mounted low to the ground. So when we have a dipole antenna and its radiation pattern, when it's low to the ground, some of the energy will go out, but it mostly goes up. Well, a NVIS antenna takes this to an extreme, goes even lower to the ground, and sends most of its energy straight up, up to the ionosphere, where it is refracted or reflected back down to Earth. And when this happens, it can actually go on the other side of a mountain, for example. If there's a mountain between you and another group, well, it can go up and then on the other side. So NVIS antennas are just dipole antennas that are mounted low to the ground. They're also known as cloud burners or cloud warmer antennas, sending most of the antenna, the energy from the antenna up to the ionosphere, where it comes down kind of as a blanket in the area, and it can be received by stations that otherwise couldn't receive VHF UHF. You can't get that through a mountain, but this can go up and over the mountain and back on the other side. That's a NVIS antenna. All right, let's answer some questions and then we can take a break. So what happens when antennas at opposite ends of a VHF or UHF line-of-sight radio link are not using the same polarization?
Bravo.
Yeah, for direct path signals, if you're not using the same polarization, then your signal strength is going to be reduced by 20 to 30 dB. So which of the following results from the fact that signals propagated by the ionosphere are elliptically polarized?
Bravo.
You can use either vertical or horizontally polarized antennas. That's on HF. So what is the relationship between the electric and magnetic fields of an electromagnetic wave?
Delta.
They are at right angles with each other. And what property of a radio wave defines its polarization? It is the physical orientation of the antenna, and it's also the
Alpha.
orientation of the electric field. The electric field is the operative field. So what are the two components of a radio wave?
C.
C.
Electric
Yep,
and magnetic.
electric and magnetic fields. Yep, correct. And which decibel value most closely represents a power increase from 5 watts to 10 watts?
Bravo.
B.
So it's times 2, which is the same as saying 3 dB. And which decibel value most closely represents a power decrease from 12 watts to 3 watts?
Charlie.
So that's a decrease of 4 times. So that's 6 dB, but it's going down, so it's minus 6 dB. So which decibel value represents a power increase from 20 watts to 200 watts?
Alpha.
Yep, 10 dB is 10 times. It's a logarithmic relationship. So what is antenna gain?
C. Charlie.
Yes, it is the increase in signal strength in a specified direction when compared to a reference antenna, typically an isotropic antenna. And ladies and gentlemen, you made it through to the intermission. Let's go ahead and take 5 minutes, get up and move around, and we'll see you back on the other side for the last 2 sections. you got a chance to stretch and move around. We had a little piece of plastic or something fell off of one of the lights during the first half. Kind of freaked me out. I'm going, what the heck is coming down? The things that happened. Anyway, glad to have you back. Let's go ahead and complete sections 4.3 and 4.4. 4.3 is on feed lines and standing wave ratios, or SWR. So parts of the transmission system, from the transmitter through the coaxial cable out to the antennas, have what we call impedances, or nominal impedances. You might remember that an impedance is the combination of a resistance and a reactance, an inductive reactance or a capacitive reactance. Don't need to know the details of that, but just know that sources of RF energy like transmitters typically have an output impedance rated at 50 ohms. And then feed line or coaxial cable that's going out to an antenna also is going to have a nominal impedance, and you want it to match. So you would want to get 50 ohm coaxial cable. And then at the antenna, you would want to make adjustments there so that its feed point impedance is also 50 ohms. When you do that, when you get all of these matching, it provides for the maximum transfer of power between the various parts of the transmission system. And as I mentioned, the impedance is the combination of a resistance and a reactance of some kind to give you an impedance here on our Cartesian plane. We won't go into any more detail on this, just to know that that's what an impedance is all about. So feed lines like coaxial cable are typically going to have 50 ohm or 75 ohm impedances. 50 is the most common, and that's the one most ham radio operators will use. There's something called air-insulated hard line, which has pressurized air or nitrogen to keep moisture out of it. It's very low loss. It can be 50 ohms or 75 ohms. You can have something called ladder line. You'll see a picture here in a second, which is 450 ohms of impedance, and twin lead. I don't know if you're old as I am. You might remember TV antennas that used to be fed by 300 ohm twin lead to go to the two terminals on the back of your TV set. Well, that's also used in amateur radio as well. So here's some pictorials. A coaxial cable can be 50 ohm or 75 ohm. Here's our friend the twin lead, which we always used to use for TV antennas back in the day. And then ladder line can look like this. You can make your own even, typically 450 ohm to 600 ohm impedance. These are all special use cases. We won't go into detail as to where these are used tonight, but in the general class and in the extra class, we talk a lot more about why you might want to use one or the other. But we are all about, no matter what class of license we have and what frequency we're going to operate on, we're all about impedance matching. Making sure that the impedance of the coaxial cable is very close to the feed point impedance of the antenna, for example. And feed line losses, if you're going to have any losses in the coaxial cable, and you will have some attenuation in it just because of the nature of the beast, it shows up as heating in the cable. So just keep that in mind, that power loss in cable shows up as heating. And the number one rule with using coaxial cable is to keep it dry. Moisture is always the problem. Moisture will increase power loss. So when you put connectors on coaxial cable, for example, you want to make sure that after it's all connected up, that you tape it very well, or you use coax seal or some other means to keep moisture out of those connections. It's the same reason that for air-insulated hardline, which looks like this is what the broadcasters use. It's the same reason they put dry air or nitrogen as a pressurized agent here in the inner part of the cable, so that any moisture that would get on the surface of it is going to be forced out. If there's a leak, the air is going to leak and keep the moisture out of the cable. So these air-insulated hard lines are used by the broadcasters for their very high-power broadcast transmitters, for example. And a lot of hams, if they want the lowest loss per 100 feet, will also use hard line like this. air-insulated hard line. Now, all cables, no matter whether it's coax or hardline or even the 300 ohm twin lead or whatever, is going to have loss. And we typically talk about loss as the loss per 100 feet. And so here are some loss graphs of some various types of coaxial cable. But notice on one axis here we have the cable loss in decibels. And on this we have the frequency of the signals passing through the cables. And the higher you go in frequency, the higher the losses are going to be. No matter whether you've got the best cable or the worst cable, as you go up in frequency, losses are going to increase. And some cable types have lower losses than others. So this is something to consider. If you're putting up a VHF and UHF antenna system, make sure that the cable you're using doesn't have high losses at VHF or UHF, or if you put 100 watts into it at one end, you may only get 25 watts out the other. And the rest is going to be dissipated as heat in the coaxial cable, which, okay, in the winter it'll melt the snow, but is that doing you any good? No. And the size of the cable can matter. Here's RG58 on the left, the smaller diameter cable here, and RG213 here on the right. This is the cable that I use predominantly here at my station. And RG213 will have lower losses at all frequencies compared to the RG58, just because of the physical size of the cable gives it a lower loss characteristic. I don't know if we've got anybody here in the class or watching on YouTube that is coming to us from the CB world. But for citizens band people, we're always talking about standing wave ratio. I got to get my SWR down. What are they talking about? What is SWR? Well, we're going to try to demystify that tonight. So standing wave ratio, SWR. We're going to show you a standing wave tonight. Remember, we're all about impedance matching, because a matched impedance from the transmitter or the generator over here through the transmission line to a matched load at the other end, that's going to have the maximum transfer of power. So all of the energy can be radiated by the antenna. I want you to think of a wave. Well, let's think about an ocean wave. As an ocean wave comes in on the ocean, and it's coming in and it hits the shoreline, there's going to be a rebound wave that comes back. It may not go very far, but there's going to be a rebound because of the discontinuity between the ocean and the shoreline here. Well, the same kind of thing happens with a radio wave when it sees an impedance discontinuity. Now, the worst case is an open circuit. If there's nothing at the far end of the transmission line, all of the energy you see going from the left to the right is rebounding and coming back to the source. So this is 100% reflected power. That's not good. That's not what we want. So here is a partial reflection. You see that most of the energy is being transferred out, but some of it is coming back. And so this has got some reflected power. This is a typical case that we might see in an amateur radio station. Here's another view of partial reflection. And here's another view of a partial reflection. Notice the polarities of the waves coming back changed. That has to do with whether the load impedance is higher or lower than the source impedance. And in the very worst cases, hitting an open circuit on the bottom or a short circuit there on the top, you see the short circuit, it actually changes the polarity of the reflected wave. All right. Information that is nice to know but not necessary to know for the test, but I wanted you to see that. This is what we're striving for. We want a matched impedance where the energy that comes from the transmitter on the left is conveyed down the coax, the feed line, and is all absorbed by the antenna and radiated out into space. that's what we want. It doesn't always happen though. And in fact, in this case, we're going to look where we have energy that is being radiated from the left to the right. That's the blue wave. And if you can follow that energy that is going from left to right, and the reflected wave of equal amplitude coming back from the right, and that's the red going to the left. And notice where they add up vectorially, they create a new wave in the black. And that wave doesn't travel, unlike the forward or the reflected, which is traveling from left to right or right to left. The standing wave just stands there and is an indication of impedance mismatch. It's a discontinuity where things are not the same. And when you have things that are not the same, then you get a reflection back. I'm going to give you the next slide here. There's a URL at the bottom. I strongly urge you to take a look at this video that is on YouTube from AT&T, the archives, back in the 1950s, where this gentleman built a model, a wave model, it's a mechanical wave model, where he demonstrates the principle of reflected waves and standing wave ratio as well. So it's highly interesting. It's about 20 to 30 minutes. So if you've got some extra time, get a cup of coffee and take a look. I think you'll enjoy this one. But what we strive for is to have no reflected power. And when you have no reflected power, then the standing wave ratio, which is what hams typically use to indicate this, it will be 1 to 1. That's a perfect match. That's what we desire, is to have a standing wave ratio of 1 to 1. Well, here's close. This is 1.14 to 1, but that's darn good. This is on a standing wave ratio meter. And the meter might look like this with a digital readout, or it might be something like this that has an analog readout. Standing wave meters are installed between the transmitter's output and an antenna feed line in the ham shack, so that you can keep tabs on what's going on. Note, however, that not all standing wave metering, power metering, is created equal. The LP100 down here is pretty darn expensive. They're over $500 now, but very accurate, very reliable. Some of the other stuff might not be reliable, might be limited in the frequency range that it's designed to operate on. Here's one that's designed for VHF and UHF, but it would not work well at HF. So you need to make sure that the meter that you're using to indicate an impedance match on your system, the standing wave ratio meter, is designed for the frequencies that you want to operate on. There's another device. If you go to Hamfest, you'll see this. This is known as a directional watt meter, and you can use this to measure power in the forward direction. It has a socket here, goes in a PL259 or SO239 socket here, and it goes out as on the other side. So this would go from the transmitter out to the antenna. And you notice this little slug you have right here? These slugs are designed for certain frequency and power ranges. And so in this case, we have the arrow pointed in that direction, so it's going to measure forward power. Then if you take the slug and rotate it 180 degrees so the arrow's in the opposite direction, then you can measure reflected power on the same meter. And then on the back of the meter is a little chart where you can put the two numbers in and give you the standing wave meter. It looks something like this chart here. So a standing wave ratio, for example, of 3 to 1 is about 25% reflected power. Standing wave ratio of 1 to 1 is no reflected power. So 1 to 1 is what we're striving for. Acceptable is anything under 2 to 1. Most transmitters will accept it just fine. When you get up higher to 3 to 1, that's not so good, especially with new modern solid-state transmitters or transceivers. So here's an ICOM IC7300, probably the most popular high-frequency transceiver on the market today. ICOM has sold over 100,000 of these radios. 100,000 Flex radios only sold 30,000 or 40,000 of their radios. So, this is a lot. But this radio will protect itself. If the standing wave ratio or the impedance mismatch at the far end is above 2:1, it will start reducing power. So your 100-watt radio will become a 50-watt radio. Well, what are you going to do? I mean, okay, you can go out to the antenna and make adjustments and get better impedance matching. That's probably the preferred way to do it. There is another way, and that's called using an antenna tuner, which doesn't tune the antenna at all. It actually provides impedance coupling from the transmitter to the system. But okay, antenna tuners, or antenna couplers they're known as. It's located after the SWR meter and before the coax and the antenna. And what happens is it generates a complex conjugate, that's the term, but I call it a rebound wave. Any energy that's coming back from the antenna will get into this antenna tuner and be reflected right back out to the antenna. And the transmitter will never see that reflected power. So as far as the transmitter is concerned, it has a perfect 1-to-1 match, and it'll provide you a full 100-watt output. Now, your antenna system with the coaxial cable and the mismatch still exists, but the antenna tuner will allow you to operate into that mismatch and have a happy transmitter and be able to radiate at least some sort of a signal. Now, an antenna tuner can be like this. This is an external antenna tuner, or it could be built into the radio. The 7300 that I showed you from ICOM has a built-in antenna tuner that you can, with a push of a button, it'll do the antenna matching. And it is made up of a system, a network of either inductors in series and capacitors in parallel, or capacitors in series and inductors in parallel. This is an L-type network, or it could be a pi network like this that will actually adjust and make adjustments and generate that rebound wave to send energy back out to the antenna and make the transmitter happy. Okay, let's answer some questions. So which of the following should be considered when selecting an accessory SWR meter?
Alpha?
Yeah, they're not all created equal. The frequency and the power level will vary between units. What reading on an SWR meter indicates a perfect impedance match?
Charlie.
Yep, 1-to-1. That's what we're striving for. And note that the larger number will always be the first number. So it'll be 1-to-1, 2-to-1, 3-to-1. You never have a 1-to-3. That doesn't exist. Okay. Why do most solid-state transmitters reduce output power as SWR increases?
Alpha to protect the output.
Yes, to protect itself, to protect the output amplifier transistors. So what does an SWR reading of 4-to-1 indicate?
Danger
Delta.
Washington.
Yeah, exactly. Delta impedance mismatch is what it's saying. And what happens to power lost in a feed line?
Charlie.
Yep, it's converted into heat. And what is a benefit of low SWR?
B Bravo.
B Bravo. Yeah, you don't lose signal of being rebounded and back and forth in the coax where it's going to be generating heat. So yes, you have reduced signal loss. And what is the most common impedance of coaxial cables used in amateur radio?
Bravo.
50 ohms. And why is coaxial cable the most common feed line for amateur radio antenna systems?
Alpha.
We're Americans, we like convenience. It's easy to use and requires few special installation considerations. So what happens as the frequency of a signal in coaxial cable is increased?
C.
Not C.
Or D.
Yeah, as the frequency of a signal in coax is increased, the losses are always going to increase. No matter if it's the really good cable or the really cheap cable, this is a common characteristic. And what can cause erratic changes in SWR? Think about this one.
Bravo.
Yeah, if you have a bad connection or a bad connector or something like that, your SWR can bounce all over the place from really good to really bad. So loose connections can cause these erratic changes. Which of the following types of feed line has the lowest loss at VHF UHF?
Charlie.
What do the broadcasters use? They use air-insulated hardline because it has the lowest loss. And what is standing wave ratio?
Alpha.
Yeah, it's an indicator. It's a measure of how well a load is matched to a transmission line. All right, last section, you're doing great. Section 4.4, practical antenna systems. Do you think your HOA would approve one of these? This is one of the curtain antennas at the Voice of America in Greenville, North Carolina. Each of the towers on the left and right are 400 feet tall. There's a series of dipole antennas strung in a plane on one side, and there's a reflector screen on the opposite side. This antenna will provide 20 dB of gain in one direction. 10 dB of gain is times 10, so that's 10 times 10, or 100 times power gain, just by using this antenna. But this, of course, is not practical for us anyway, for mere mortals. Okay, we're back to our half-wave dipole. This is the antenna that you'll find most hams will put up at first. It's fed by coaxial cable and with quarter wavelength long left and right elements here. It could be supported at the center and have the sides droop down. That's called an inverted V, or it can be horizontal dipole. Well, how long do we want to make it? Well, it's a half wavelength long at the frequency that you want to operate. Remember our formula from before? 300 divided by the frequency in megahertz will give you a full wavelength, and this is half of that. So you could use that if you want to work in meters. If you don't want to work in meters, here's the conversion. 1 meter is 39.37 inches long. The formula if you want to work in feet is 468 divided by the frequency in megahertz will give you the half wavelength. So that'll be the length in feet of the dipole antenna times V, or a velocity factor. What? Well, 468 divided by F works if you are using uninsulated copper wire. If you're using insulated wire, then it's going to be a little shorter. The velocity factor will be like 0.9 or something like that, 0.95. That's the fudge factor if you're using insulated wire. That's the difference between using uninsulated and insulated wire. And why half wavelength? Well, it has to do with the voltage and current ratio on the antenna. And I won't go into the details. We do this in the other classes. But the high current, I is the current, so the radio frequency current of this antenna is highest at the center. See, it's peak, 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 peak. The voltage of this antenna is highest at the ends. High voltage, high voltage, high voltage, high voltage. This is the radio frequency wave alternating in cycle, high voltage here. So a half-wave dipole has high voltage at the ends, which is why there are insulators put on the ends. They're not there just for show. There's a reason for them. Very high voltages exist here. Very high current at the center of a half-wave dipole antenna. Just as an aside, the current portion of the antenna is the part of the antenna you want to get up the highest in the air, because the current is where the electromagnetic wave is generated from, that current point. So that's where you want to get that the highest point in the air. So a dipole antenna transmitting a signal, so the dipole antenna, if we're looking down on it, is top and bottom here. So we're looking down from above, and it radiates broadside to the dipole antenna. Not much radiation off the ends. See, here's the ends, and there's not much radiation, but it broadside to the antenna. So this is a dipole antenna transmitting a signal. The same thing happens on reception. The E field of a signal that comes in is coupled into the antenna, and it generates voltage and current in the antenna. And so this is how a dipole antenna would receive a signal as well. And the dipole antenna pattern, we said, is broadside to the antenna, kind of in a figure 8 position. And again, here we're looking down from above. Here's the axis of the antenna, and it's broadside. All right. Here we have two antennas. We have the tiny little one on the left, and we have the bigger one on the right. So what's the relationship to frequency? Well, you might have gotten it from my voice. The smaller antenna is a higher frequency antenna, and the larger antenna is a lower frequency antenna. That's the relationship. So that's why I say that, frequency is all about where you tune your radio. Wavelength is all about how big you build your antenna. So for very high frequency antennas, they're going to be smaller. For high frequency antennas, they're going to be bigger. The longer an antenna is, the lower its resonant frequency. The shorter an antenna is, the higher its resonant frequency. And an antenna is a resonant circuit at some frequency. We're not going to go into resonance here in the technician class to any extent, but just the definition of resonance is, here's series resonance. It's when the inductive reactance is equal to the capacitive reactance. When that happens, magic occurs. In a parallel resonant circuit, the same thing, when the capacitive reactance is equal to the inductive reactance, and that happens only at one frequency. That's known as the resonant frequency. And so antennas will have a resonant frequency. We're going to look more here in just a sec. We looked at a half-wave dipole antenna. Remember, it's a quarter wavelength on one side and a quarter wavelength on the other side. Well, if you turn that on end and put radials at 90 degrees from the vertical element, this is a quarter wavelength vertical antenna. Its height is 1/4 wavelength, and the horizontal elements there provide a counterpoise or a mirror effect. And for quarter wavelength HF antennas, they can be just lying on the ground, the counterpoise or the radial elements, where the vertical antenna is going quarter wavelength high, so maybe 30, 40 feet being supported by a fiberglass mast or something like that. So a quarter wavelength antenna, very common, very practical in amateur radio. For VHF and UHF, you'll have quarter wave vertical antennas on your car, and also then you'll have something called a 5/8 wave. A 5/8 wave requires a matching section before you can use it, but it actually has a lower angle of radiation, whereas a quarter wavelength might have its maximum radiation lobe up here. The 5/8 has it lower to the ground, which gives it some apparent gain over a quarter wavelength antenna. So we say that a 5/8 wave has lower angle of radiation, which means higher gain horizontally. And if you can, if you're on your car, if you're going to put a mobile antenna, the best place to put the antenna for omnidirectional coverage is at the center of the roof. Now that isn't always practical. Sometimes you have to put it off to the corner of the car, but know when you do that you are going to get some directionality. All right, so I mentioned that antennas are resonant at some frequency, and the resonant frequency formula, this is what it looks like. You won't have to use it, you don't have to know about it, but I want you to point out something. So and I'll just describe the formula. It's the frequency of resonance is equal to 1 divided by 2 pi square root of L in henries and C in farads, inductance and capacitance. So that's how you can calculate the resonant frequency of a circuit. The thing I want to point out to you is that if you increase L or if you increase C because of the 1 over, you are going to lower the resonant frequency of the circuit. So more inductance or more capacitance gives you a lower frequency of resonance. Or another way of saying that, it can make an antenna that is really physically short look electrically longer. And that's the point of what we call loading an antenna. This is a loading coil. It makes an antenna appear to be electrically longer by adding L, or inductance in this case. So that's why you'll have the ability to do high frequency radio from a car. A quarter wave vertical antenna for 40 meters is going to be 33 feet high. Well, you couldn't have that with a car, but with loading coils you can make it physically shorter and still be resonant on the 40-meter band. So just some information for you there. We talked about the Yagi antenna before. Remember, we had the half wavelength driven element, and we had a reflector which is about 5% longer, and we had a director which is about 5% shorter, and it's directional in this direction. There's another kind of directional antenna called the cubical quad, which was invented at HCJB in Quito, Ecuador, and it consists of full wave loops which are driven by coaxial cable, and then you have a reflector element which is about 5% longer, and director elements which are about 5% shorter. The cubical quad has certain advantages. It doesn't have high voltage points like the Yagi does at the tips, but it's also mechanically more difficult to construct and to keep up in the air. And if you've got a satellite antenna on your house for a dish network or something like that, directional antennas, well, satellite antennas are highly directional with a main lobe and some side lobes, so just keep that in mind. And what hams do when we're making adjustments, I told you that the best thing to do is to make sure that the antenna is matched to the coax. Well, we use things called antenna analyzers. Antenna analyzers have a built-in transmitter, a built-in signal generator, and the ability to measure impedance and to measure reactance and resistance. So this is MFJ 259. There are a bunch of others. Rig Expert and others make them. So antenna analyzers are used to measure an antenna's impedance and resonant frequency and make adjustments to get better impedance matching. Your first radio is likely going to be an HT, and it has an antenna as well. That rubber duck antenna that's sticking up there, it's rugged. It's probably not going to break, but it's not a very effective antenna. It's got some inductive loading to make it look a little longer than it really is, but it's really poor inside of a car, for example, because the car shields the radio frequency signals. So much better is to have an antenna, a mag mount antenna on the roof of the car, for example, connected to your HT. That would work much better. And so you're going to connect it up using coaxial cable and various connectors. A lot of modern HTs are using the SMA connector. This is a very good connector for very high frequencies and ultra high frequencies. N connectors, named after Mr. Neal of AT&T. It's a waterproof coaxial connector. A bayonet connector, BNC, is another very popular connector. But the granddaddy of them all, and the most popular, is what's known as a UHF connector, also known by the military designator PL259. The PL259 is the most popular high-frequency connector, and generally you would install a PL259 in coaxial cable using a soldering iron, a rosin core solder, a very heavy-duty soldering iron in order to get the connector to hold the solder. Okay, I abandoned this approach years ago after I had intermittent connections on a bunch of jumper cables. So there's another way that you can put connectors onto coaxial cable, and that's by crimping them. So in this case, the shield, the outer shield of the cable is crimped to the connector, and you solder the center conductor. And so this is the method that I use, and I've had really great results with crimped connectors. I mentioned the N connector. The N connector is used for signals above 400 megahertz. It's a waterproof connection. Remember I said moisture is always the problem with coaxial cable? Well, this has got a rubber grommet in there, and so when it's tight, it's waterproof. Well, that's great, the N connector used by AT&T because it was invented by one of their engineers. If you're going to be using solder in electrical work, you always want to use rosin core solder, never acid core solder. Acid core is very hard to find anymore, but it used to be used in plumbing applications. And if you're going to be doing soldering, you need some practice. You want a shiny joint. You don't want anything that's dull or rough or lumpy. See the cracks here? These are bad solder joints. You want something that's shiny and flows well. These would be known as cold solder joints, which are probably going to give you all sorts of intermittent problems, which you don't want. All right, let's answer some questions. What antenna polarization is normally used for long distance CW and SSB contacts on the VHF and UHF bands? We talked about this early on.
Charlie?
Horizontal, indeed, because you're going to avoid all those vertical mobile antennas. So when using a directional antenna, how might your station be able to communicate with a distant repeater if buildings or obstructions are blocking the direct line of sight path?
B.
Yeah, try to find a path that reflects the signals to the repeater. Where should an RF power meter be installed?
Alpha.
Yes, it's in the coax, in the feed line, between the transmitter and the antenna. And which of the following is used to determine if an antenna is resonant at the desired operating frequency?
B. Bravo.
Yep, an antenna analyzer like that MFJ one that I showed you, or others. And which instrument can be used to determine SWR?
D. Directional watt meter?
Yeah, the directional watt meter we looked at with the slug with the arrow pointing in one direction or the other, yeah. All right, and which of the following causes failure of coaxial cables? What's the problem?
Alpha.
Moisture, yeah, you got to keep them dry. And why should the outer jacket of coaxial cable be resistant to ultraviolet light?
Delta.
Yes, ultraviolet light can damage the jacket and allow water to enter the cable. Water is always the problem. And what is a disadvantage of air core coaxial cable when compared to foam or solid dielectric types? It's what the broadcasters use.
More loss per foot.
No.
A. No.
No. C, yes. So the air core, we got to keep that air inside of it without moisture. So you either pressurize it with a nitrogen, or you can use air dryers and use dry air that doesn't have any humidity to prevent moisture in the cable. So which of the following types of solder should not be used for radio and electronic applications?
A. Alpha.
Yeah, acid core solder, it'll eat up the printed circuit boards. So what is the characteristic appearance of a cold tin lead solder joint?
C.
Yeah, a rough or lumpy surface. And what is a beam antenna?
Charlie.
It's an antenna that concentrates signals in one direction. And which of the following describes a type of antenna loading? They're called loaded antennas.
B, Bravo?
Not Bravo.
Or A, Alpha?
Yes, you're electrically lengthening by inserting an inductor in the radiating element, that coil. And which of the following describes a simple dipole oriented parallel to the Earth's surface?
B, Bravo.
Yes, that would be a horizontally polarized antenna. And what is the disadvantage of the short, flexible antenna supplied with most handheld radio transceivers?
A, low efficiency.
Yeah, I didn't really emphasize this, but yeah, it's really small. It has very low ability to radiate a signal. It has low efficiency. And which of the following increases the resonant frequency of a dipole antenna? If you want to increase the frequency of a dipole antenna, what do?
Shorten it.
You shorten it. You make it smaller. Its resonant frequency will go up. So which of the following types of antenna offers the greatest gain?
5/8 A.
No.
Yeah.
D,
Yeah,
Delta?
think our Japanese friends, Yagi Uda. Their beam antennas have higher gain than any of these others. About 12 dB of gain. So what is the disadvantage of using a handheld VHF transceiver with a flexible antenna inside a vehicle?
A, Alpha.
Yes, signal strength is reduced due to the shielding effect of the vehicle. All right, what is the approximate length in inches of a quarter wavelength vertical antenna for 146 megahertz? We're not going to go through the math. You could use the 468 divided by the frequency in megahertz, but just know that it's 19 inches. 19 inches is the length for a quarter wavelength vertical. All right, what is the approximate length in inches of a half wave vertical for 6 meters? So a half wave would be 3 meters. 3 meters times 39 inches would give you about 112 inches. I'm rushing because we're out of time, actually. In which direction does a half-wave dipole antenna radiate the strongest signal? What do you think?
B, Bravo.
Not off the ends. It has very poor radiation off the ends.
Delta.
Yeah, broadside to the antenna is where the radiation is the strongest. And what is an advantage of a 5/8 wave for VHF and UHF?
Range.
Well, not range, but
No.
what would you call it? The example it has more gain than a quarter wavelength antenna. And what is the major function of an antenna tuner?
A, Alpha.
Yes, it matches the antenna system impedance to the transceiver's output impedance. It makes the transmitter happy. So which of the following RF connector types is most suitable for frequencies above 400 megahertz?
And B.
Yep, that's from Mr. Neal of AT&T, the type N connector. And which of the following is true of PL259 connectors?
Charlie.
They're the most popular, they're the most common used for HF and VHF. Which of the following is a source of loss in coaxial feed line? Read carefully.
Bravo.
Bravo's correct.
D, all the above.
All of
D,
the
yep.
above, yeah. Water intrusion and multiple connectors in the line all have some loss. So what is the electrical difference between RG58 and RG213? Small cable, big cable.
Charlie. C.
Yeah, 213 has less loss at a given frequency. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of Chapter 4. You made it. We're 33 minutes after the hour. I'm sorry I kept you late tonight. So let's just say I appreciate you being here with us. And next week we will go on to Chapter 5. Anywhere. Hang in there. You're doing great. We're going to be halfway, more than halfway through by next week. Until then, 73, y'all. See you next week.
Thanks, Gary.
Thank you.
Thank you.